No, well, no. I was
No, I thought there were 3.
Once is enough.
levels.
If you're really beyond X, you don't have to go any further.
Okay.
There's nowhere else to go.
So is this the time where you could...
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, it's going to come up today because part of what we didn't finish, as usual, last time, the previous assignment, at the very end, maybe we could...
No, actually,
Well, I'm going to do that in a moment. At the very end, he says, Heidegger says, he's going to, the translator, deviate into the beyond, he says, at the very end of the last assignment, which we'll come to in a moment.
Okay.
And I wanted to connect that both to the beyond being, which is Plato's definition of the good in the Republic. And it was in that context that I raised the issue of the beyond X. So yes, I'm going to revisit it. I intend to revisit it very shortly. So I won't start with it.
Okay.
Any other observations, questions? Okay. If there are none, I don't know whether you noticed, but especially in today's assignment, this text finally seems to be coming to a head. So a lot of the stuff that happens in today's assignment works in a way to clarify things that are maybe not so clear earlier in the text. And in a certain sense, that helps me to play catch-up because I don't have to spend so much time on catching up from the last assignment because a lot of the main issues are repeated in a more accessible way in today's assignment. That having been said, I can't remember, you have to help me, whether or not I know I alluded to it, whether we looked last time at his comments on the transcendental subjectivity of Kant on page 178. I don't think we quite got there. Yeah, okay, so let's just take a quick look at that. On page 178 in number 134, he says in the second paragraph of 134, but if we fail to recognize in advance the strangeness and uniqueness, incomparability of being, and as far as that goes, as I think I've indicated before, one of the points of, I don't know whether contact is the right word, maybe resonance would be a more appropriate word in the context. There are ways in which Heidegger's thinking here resonates with the thinking now occurring up to a point. And one of the ways in which it resonates with the thinking now occurring is his emphasis on uniqueness and his emphasis, what was the other phrase he puts together with it? Strangeness. Strangeness is a little too strange for the thinking now occurring, but the notion of absolute otherness, you see, at a certain level, if I was thinking self-consciously, I would think of otherness as alienness, and I would be thinking, therefore, implicitly of some sort of strangeness, right? So that connotation of otherness doesn't carry over into thinking now occurring, but the emphasis on the unfamiliar, the different, and the uniqueness of that difference is as I say, as it were, a point of resonance or contact with the thinking now occurring. Nevertheless, I hope today, and especially in the light of today's assignment, to be able to show in some very fundamental ways where Heidegger's thinking fundamentally is not compatible with the thinking now occurring. But to continue the sentence, and together with it, what is owned most to Dasein, then we succumb all too easily to the opinion that this relation corresponds to or is even commensurate with the relation between subject and object. But Dasein has overcome all subjectivity, and being is never an object representable. So this goes back to one of the things that came up in the first class, I think, when we were trying to say that in some very important sense, Heidegger's understanding is, I don't know whether I should say beyond, it's really, I think the word I put on this handout, did I put the word on the handout or I just say it in class? But it's relevant to the beyond X issue. Heidegger is really hither consciousness. He's on this side of consciousness, or in the language which we have hit upon in this course, which I kind of like, he's undermining, and in that sense he's before consciousness and self-consciousness in particular, and certainly therefore, as he points out here and elsewhere throughout, he's hither or before or underneath, in the only sense in which being prior to anything has meaning for Heidegger. He is before or hither or underneath or undermining the subject-object relationship, which is fundamental to the notion of self-consciousness as it's developed in modernity. And he associates that with, over and over again, this is another example of it, he associates that subject-object structure of self-consciousness with the notion of the representable, the representation, the idea is what he has in mind here. He here, specifically, by using the term representation, is specifically referring implicitly to the Cartesian notion of the idea, right? Now, of course, as I pointed out to you, Heidegger has a tendency, for his own purposes, to blur the distinction between the Platonic idea and the Cartesian idea, right? The Platonic idea doesn't quite have the context of subjectivity that the Cartesian idea absolutely has, all right? So I don't want to go over that again. I just can't help noticing it every time I notice that he doesn't consistently draw those distinctions or point to them, because it's not to his purpose, so to speak, all right? Okay. It is in every case only a being that is capable of becoming an object, and even here, not every being. But what if subjectivity, and thus the relation to the objectness of the object, is grasped transcendentally, as in Kant? And what if beyond this the object nature counts as the solely experienceable being, and thus objectness coincides with beingness? Is there not here an opportunity? And now the key word here, I think, is opportunity, all right? Is there not here an opportunity, even a historically unique basic position in which, in spite of all... so it's an opportunity, but notice now, don't misunderstand, an opportunity in spite of all essential differences, all the essential differences that exist between the thinking, the inceptual thinking that Heidegger is doing in this text, and the transcendental subjectivity of Kant. There are essential differences here. We're just not going to overlook that. But nevertheless, isn't there, in spite of those essential differences, some sort of an opportunity for the first time to render accessible to those of today that relation of Dasein and being out of what has gone before? Of course, and that is attempted in the Kant book, his book on Kant. But that was only possible by using force against Kant. Right? So in other words, if I'm Heidegger and I'm trying to show some relationship, despite essential differences, between the thinking that we're now doing in the crossing between the first and the second beginning, if I'm attempting to show that, I can show it only by going against Kant in doing, it's using Kant against Kant, so to speak, to try and elucidate what relationship there might be in the direction of a more, so against Kant, in the direction of a more originary keyword, grasping of precisely the transcendental projecting open in its one-foldness by working out the transcendental power of imagination. Now that issue comes up again in today's assignment, where he, in a more positive way now, right? Now he's setting it up, and he fulfills it in today's assignment. He understands that Dasein and time-space, as he calls it over and over again, time-space for Heidegger in his originary understanding of time-space, right, is the site for the moment, all right? And that's that moment in which there is steadfastness, in which, in an originary sense, we have the end of being, right? Not the end of being in a linear sense. That's another issue that comes up again explicitly, happily, finally, in today's assignment, all right? But with all of those qualifications, all right, time, space, I'm going to say it when I get to that part of the text, but I'll anticipate myself. Time, space, going back to Kant, you see, precisely going back to Kant, time and space in Kant are the forms, the fundamental forms of what Kant calls the transcendental imagination, right? So again, this idea of undermining, I think, is really the right term here, right? In other words, it's undermining in the sense that it's pulling out from under the first beginning. It's how can I put it? It's blind self-reliance, right? It's blindness to its, I want to say, indebtedness to a much more originary selfhood, right? So it's pulling out from under the first beginning its self-reliance in that oblivious sense of being oblivious to the originary depth of what truth there is, of what truth of being it does have. It's not that it has no truth of being, but it has a truth of being which in a certain sense is, and this is not incompatible with what he says, I think again in today's assignment especially, with untruth, okay? Recognizing that untruth is not a simple alternative to the truth of being even, you understand? So in a certain sense, I think one could fairly understand what Heidegger is really saying here, if we put it in grossly oversimplified terms, just for the sake of making the point, that the whole first beginning, as much as we want to rail against it and continually criticize it and attempt to get underneath it and undermine it and get to the originary depth and so forth and so on, is nevertheless, in some fundamental sense, it is the doing of being. Do you see that it's part of that intimate strife in the cleavage of being, you see, which takes the form historically of the strife in effect, you see, in this, I want to say in this, I don't know, let's just say constructive, but in this positive sense, the strife between the first and the second beginning, right? So that if we were dealing here in a Hegelian world, I could say it's a dialectical relationship, right? But I can't quite say it's a dialectical relationship without bending Heidegger a little bit out of shape, right? But it's the analog of a dialectical relationship. The truth of the being of metaphysics is in some sense, nevertheless, more originarily understood, an untruth of being, which untruth of being, nevertheless, do you see, is part of the intimate cleavage of being, in which being, in some sense, is in strife with itself. If I can put it that way, it might be a little bit, maybe I need better, more softer language, but I just want to get that notion out, right? So it's not that we're leaving behind, as Heidegger has already said. We're not simply leaving behind the past as false, all right? Or in any simple sense, untrue.
But that's also why he is careful not to speak of the second beginning. He's speaking of the other beginning.
Yeah.
You said the second beginning.
Oh, did I say that?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad you caught me on that. I shouldn't have said that. You're right. Okay, that's right.
Precisely because of
Yeah.
that linkage.
Yes, okay. Yes, yeah, that's good. That's a nice point. I like that. Okay. See, it's good to have somebody paying attention to what you say, because I wasn't. All right. Okay, so the imagination, now we're going to hit that again today, so I don't know whether we have to dwell on that at the moment. Well, let me just finish the thought here. So certainly this Kant interpretation is historically, in history as a discipline, incorrect, all right? From a you might say from a pedantic point of view, Heidegger's reading of Kant is incorrect from a pedantic point of view, right? Nevertheless, it is historically, where it we're already talking about history, where it really counts, it's essential, i.e. considered as preparatory for future thinking, and only as that, it is a historical referral to something totally different. All right. All right, 185. This issue keeps coming up, and it'll come up again in today's assignment. The question of the last God, and on page 185, he gives us fleshed out a little bit more what the connotation of that terminology is. In the paragraph just about in the middle of page 185, thinking comes into that remote nearness in and through that God's history as self-grounding, but never in the form of a result, a producing kind of representing that shelters God. All such claims, seemingly very high claims, are low and a degradation of being, and owning and its enjoining in the abgroundness of time-space is the net in which the last God suspends itself in order to rend it and to let itself come to its end in its uniqueness. All right. So again, this is a positive way of understanding what end is going to mean. And again, he's going to hit it a little more directly and explicitly in today's assignment. What end can mean here when we're not dealing on the level of self-consciousness or in the level of Kantian linear temporality. What end and by implication what therefore death means in this context. And it has to do with this fundamental, what I would call structural uniqueness, godly and rare, and the strangest among all beings. All right. As I say, that will come up, that question of the end will come up again, and the last God comes up again in today's assignment. On page 187, the nothing, which again, I think comes up happily in today's assignment, but nevertheless is a nice discussion of it, brief discussion of it, if you want to put it that way, on page 187. And then on a 188 in particular, he's already told us early on that the not, and the nothing belong to being, right? On page 188, if I can find the exact place, well, let's maybe starting at the bottom of 187. My questioning of the nothing, which arises from the question concerning the truth of being, has nothing at all in common with all of that. The nothing is neither something negative, nor is it a goal. Rather, it is the essential and quivering of being itself, and therefore is more being than any beings. Now, this more being comes up again in today's assignment, where being is more being than any being. And somewhere, I think in the previous assignment, one or two back, he has already explicitly equated nothing and being, right? Finite being and nothing. They are undifferentiated terms, you might say. Reminds me of my little metaphor of the mathematical metaphor that I called attention to, I guess, when we first started on Heidegger, namely that if you take the circle and understand the center of the circle is a point, and that point, however, is not a dimensional, it's zero dimension, meaning in the context it's nothing, all right? Well, then if you stop and think about it, I said every point on that continuity, which is the sphere, is equally nothing. So the whole damn thing, all right, is nothing. Okay, and so Heidegger is fundamentally acknowledging that in his pre-mathematical way, right? That the finite being, which is where it's at for him, is nevertheless interchangeably the nothing. Now, the nothing in that case is, as he's at pains over and over again to point out, and I think here again is another example of it, is not to be understood in any kind of simple alpha privative sense, not in any simple lack sense, you see, but that this nothing is somehow or other, I can't say in Heidegger's context productive, because that's a bad notion of creation, but it is creative, right? It is, right, just as being, which is its interchange, with which it is interchangeable, is creative, all right? It comes up, it's a great metaphor he uses today. I can't resist anticipating it. When he talks about the jug, all right, and the jug is hollow. It's got a hollow inside, and you would think that you put the jug, so to speak, around the empty space. Right? No. The hollow calls forth the limit. The hollow calls forth the walls around itself. All right, we'll come back to that. But there's a very concrete and very vivid understanding of what you could call the creative, Heidegger's understanding that the nothing is creative, that the emptiness is creative. So it's not in any kind of simplistic sense. Well, It is what I would I refer to in Novitas Mundi. It is the way in which Heidegger. Oh, you know what I said? I was being playful. I didn't know quite whether it was appropriate, but now I think it is. I said, I think last time or the time before, that what's really going on in Heidegger is the surfacing. That was my expression, which I like in general. It was the surfacing of the pure potentiality of modernity, which I allude to. I mean, I specify it in Novitas Mundi, right? But it doesn't get acknowledged, one could say, explicitly until you get to Heidegger. Now, I want to go back over my little phraseology and see that it really works better than I had imagined when it popped out of my mouth, that in Heidegger, the potentiality is surfaced, I say. Yeah? Well, read, in Heidegger, the hollow is jugged. Right? So you understand what I'm saying? The nothing creates its, as it were, its enclosure. Right? It creates its own inclusionness, being includedness, for want of a better term that I can put it, right? So in that sense, it surfaces, it makes a surface for itself, but of course, unlike the thinking now occurring, we don't have absolute superficiality, you see. We have surface that is indebted, that's my language, indebted to, owes its being, do you see, to the nothing, do you see, behind which or within which, you see, the nothing is to be, in that sense, distinguished from the surface which it otherwise calls forth, to use Heidegger's terminology. All right. But to come back to the text here, so I was going from the bottom of 187, nor is it a goal. Rather, it is the essential enquivering of being itself, and therefore is more being than any beings. For those of you who just got the handout for the first time today, I just call your attention to the fact that in trying to understand what this enquivering, it's a recurrent phrase in Heidegger, and I made reference to Todd in his absence last time as the musician, right? So if you think of the tuning fork, right, and the being attuned in more senses than one in Heidegger, right? The enquivering, when you strike the tuning fork, what do you get? You get resonance, and the counter resonance, which is the fundamental metaphor for the relationship between Dasein and being and you name it. Wherever we would have in Hegel dialectical opposition as a function of the dialectical movement, you see, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. No. More originarily, what we don't have dialectical movement. You see, we have resonance, we have vibration, we have enquivering. I checked the German. I mean, what is it? Zitterung. Is it? Zitterung. Is both. Literally, it's both quivering, and vibrating. So in English, we would be more comfortable saying that the tuning fork vibrates. And as it's vibrating, it's resonating. All right. In other words, you hear it. In other words, it's not just a visual thing. You can see it vibrating if you're looking closely, and you are hearing the sound at the same time. All right.
It's also trembling.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, so I just on this handout, I'm just connecting, so to speak, backwards what I've just said. What's going on here philosophically? What's going on here philosophically that more fundamental than dialectical movement is this enquivering, this vibrating, you see, which is not going to resolve into an identity those elements which are counter-resonating with one another, whatever the context might be, gods and man, being and Dasein, right? However you slice it, so to speak, that enquivering goes on. In fact, today he really confesses. He fesses up. It's really great. And he says that I think it's being and Dasein won't let each other free. Right? It's they're gonna hold, but he understands, right, that this belonging to being I don't care if belonging to being involves being belonging to me. The real issue is that as long as we're dealing with belongingness, neither one of the belonger belongings, right, is going to get free of this. Right? That's where we're at. Okay. So if you, so owning, okay, and ownhood, which is a really, it's got some great stuff in today's, right? Ownhood, owndom, as kingdom. I mean, it's great. It's great. Okay, it's just terrific. Okay, so there's no doubt about it, but it becomes, as I say, I guess as we go on, clearer and clearer. Okay, now what did we want to do here originally? We wanted to say, okay, so the nothing then is essentially the equivalent of being itself, and I think I've already. Oh, and it's more being than other beings. Okay, now the more being than other beings is again significant because in today's assignment, being is more being. Okay, now that we've already acknowledged that he has equated nothing and being. Right? This nothing, which is not, this nothing which is creative. And he has told us on page 77 that his objection to the medieval notion of the creator is that the creator took over what belonged to being, right? But that creator in medieval thought, in Heidegger's reading of it, is more being. And what Heidegger is saying retrospectively is, that was a mistake, right? He said, I love the appropriation backwards, right? So in other words, looking backwards from the point of being post-appropriation, as it were, not post-ownhood or owndom, but being post-appropriation in the modern self-conscious sense, he can look back nevertheless and in effect understand that medieval theology appropriated to the creator the more being that belongs, as we discover explicitly in today's text, to being, to finite being, right? So in a certain sense, now this gets a little, I got to start over?
You can stop the thing having this to it.
I can't. I'm on a roll. I can't go back again.
I'll try to jump on the board. Sorry to be so late.
All right. Better late than never. My mother used to say that. I began to appreciate it as I got older.
That's what I figured.
Where were we? I don't know where we were. More being. Oh, I was going to say that issue gets a little more subtle. We need to look at it again in today's assignment, where what I've just alluded to is explicitly mentioned by Heidegger. That is, that being is more being. Here he says on page 188 that nothing is more being. Okay, but we've acknowledged the the interchangeability of nothing, creative nothing, and being in Heidegger. Okay, I think that's enough for that page anyway. And then I think a nice touch to keep in mind, it goes back to the way in which he was thinking in Being and Time. On page 198, he gives us a nice definition of mastery. And that's important because mastery comes up in a number of different contexts, right? We have the mastery of the end, the last God's mastery of the end, and so forth, right? And we also have the contrast, which I put on the handout, between absolute knowledge in Hegel and masterful knowledge, or absolute knowing in Hegel and masterful knowing in Heidegger, right? So on 198, he gives us, again, if I can put my finger on it,
Middle of paragraph.
just about a little above the middle of the page, second paragraph of 159 on page 198, splitting this cleft and thus parting it in togetherness as mastery, that is the origin that leaps forth. Mastery is, or better, holds sway. I really appreciate that. I mean, here we have he has to correct himself, and that's good. I mean, it's just, there's no way of getting it absolutely right? Mastery is, or better, holds sway as legacy, and does not itself bequeath, but rather bequeaths the continuing originariness. And the analog of this notion in Being and Time was the notion of retrieval, going back to the origin, not meaning some kind of simple-minded going back, to the past as some sort of an object, but going back and retrieving the potentiality of that past, but the potential, or achieving the past, retrieving the past as insofar as it was potentiality, which, by the way, would be a way of characterizing the whole enterprise of his thinking, right? So that would be the analog of that, if not the same thing in some sense, in this text. All right. And therefore, on that same page, the other characteristics, I don't know if it's in the same place. Mastery, somewhere on this page, he also speaks of it as the necessity of the free to be free. Do you see that? Next paragraph. Okay, so let's read that. Mastery is the necessity of the free to be free. It holds mastery and sway as unconditionality in the domain of freedom. Again, all I can say there is the thinking now occurring would just want to eliminate altogether from that notion the necessity of the free to be free. That freedom is in no sense in the thinking now occurring a necessity. It's just a fact. And therefore, I would say, what goes away in the thinking now occurring in this context with the necessity. And by the way, that necessity of the free to be free is a carryover, I would say, from the necessity, which is that outermost shell of the Hegelian notion of freedom, right? The necessity that is the necessity, which is the prior of freedom, that against which, or in terms of which, freedom defines itself in Hegel, or in the context of which freedom is defined. This is the undermined version of that in Heidegger. And the thinking now occurring, that necessity goes away, and the only necessity we discover that we have in the thinking now occurring is necessity after the fact. And you could say that the first fact that precedes, as it were, necessity after the fact, that the fact is freedom, which is preceded by no necessity in the thinking now occurring. And what I was about to say was, with that also vanishes in the thinking now occurring the notion of mastery. And mastery is a nice term here. He gives it a nice context. But remember, again, with the Hegelian background here, mastery is one of the poles of the master-slave relationship. All right, mastery is, whether we like it or not, and maybe Heidegger really ultimately doesn't object to this notion. He obviously doesn't. Mastery is bound up with ownership, right? And here we have post-Nietzsche, right? In other words, the best face that could be put upon mastery is, in Nietzsche's still too metaphysical formulation, it's self-mastery, self-overcoming. He has an analogous notion of self-outgrowing. Heidegger does, somewhere in either today's or last time's assignment. So what I'm getting at is that mastery is ultimately related to the notion of ownership, and ultimately related, therefore, to the notion of owndom and ownhood and kingdom and sovereignty, and therefore, if not subjectivity, you see, the selfhood, that is the more originary ground of modern subjectivity. Okay, I think. So now we come to your opening question, and I can kill a couple of birds with one stone there, although I don't think we're through with it there. But at the very end of the last assignment on page 203, now the context for this, let me read it, and then we'll go back over the context. Beginning at the very bottom of 202, he says, occurrence of the truth of being. That is essential swaying. Thus, essential swaying is never a way of being that is added on to being, or even one that persists in itself above being. By what means must this manner of seemingly genuine continuation of questioning, a being, its being, and then being of being, etc., be cut off and redirected into genuine questioning. Right? So, of course, there's been questioning all along in philosophy. I mean, there's nothing new about that questioning, right? But it hasn't been genuine questioning, right? Has, as he says in today's assignment, has it ever been before Heidegger that questioning was the beginning and end? That's what he says literally today, happily. Thank God he says that, because you know who the beginning and the end is. It's ego, right? I am the Alpha and the Omega, right? Check out the Faith and Philosophy appendix, right? It's central to that analysis in the appendix to Faith and Philosophy. It builds on that, and we have the analog of that, which I want to parse more closely when we get to it in today's assignment, in Heidegger today. That and we have to understand that it's no accident, right? That precisely in place of ego, I have questioning. Questioning is the beginning and the end, all right? And that's the depth, you see, the originary depth. Oh, I want to say, because we have this peculiar term, Abgrund, and somewhere, I don't know if it was the last time or this time, he gives us, in effect, a definition of it, if you want a simple definition of it, and that is its originary depth. Originary depth, Abgrund. And so, well, why is he saying that? It's to be distinguished from what, certainly in English, I don't know how this would work in German, but in English, what you would think of Abgrund, your first inclination, I think, is to think abyss. Abyss. If the ground falls out, if the ground is is somehow it's not literal, you understand? But if it's, as it were, absent, if it's removed, all right, then, it's all the way down. No. Right? That would be abyss. Right? But Abgrund is originary depth. Right? It's the analog of nothing's not being simply a lack. You say it's where you would have abyss, we have Abgrund. We have the originary depth, which is really, you say, that from which both the first and the other beginning come forth. All right, that's kind of an aside. Now, so let me continue this here. So, as long as everything stays with ousia, on page 203, being, substance is a normal Aristotelian translation of that, or perhaps a better translation. There's no perfect translation, right? I guess the best translation is being. Or maybe Heidegger's beingness. Maybe you could let him say, that's not bad. Beingness might be a little better even than being. I'm not sure. The ousia gives you the notion of the ness-ness, I think. So, okay. Or, as Aristotle sometimes translated in English, ousia would be primary being, right? But primary being in the sense that for Aristotle, among the categories, substance, ousia, all right, is primary in the sense that everything else presupposes it. Aristotle wouldn't think this way, but we look at it and we say everything else presupposes substance. Or if there's no substance, then we're not going to have any relations. We're not going to have any quality. We're not going to have any quantity. We're not going to have any place, and so forth and so on. All right. So that's the primary being. As long as everything stays with ousia, a ground for no longer continuing the questioning in the same manner is not to be found. The only thing left is to deviate. All right. So in other words, Heidegger doesn't want to stay with ousia. Right. The only thing left is to deviate into epekaina, which is beyond. Now, the context for this, which we did discuss last time, right, goes back to, I guess it's page, I don't remember what page it's on, where he talks of, where he's doing a critique of Plato, and it's the Platonic idea of the good that he's doing the critique of, right? And the Platonic idea of the good by Plato is defined in the Republic as epekaina tes ousias. The good is beyond ousia. It's beyond being, okay? Now, Heidegger's not happy with that idea. And that's where the idea of I guess last time where I brought up the question of, okay, so what I said, do I do it here? I don't know where I did all this.
Good and evil.
I did it in class, but did I do it on this handout? I don't think so. Okay, maybe I'll have to amend the handout again. If you have in mind that when Plato defines you'll pardon me for doing it this way, what for him would be maybe I don't need to be pardoned. For Plato, the idea of the good, as we normally think of it, as the idea of the good, although it's a peculiar idea because it's an idea which you cannot look at, you cannot perceive the way you can all the ideas that derive from it in Plato, right? So it's an idea which is, in a certain sense, no idea. You see, it's the historical root of the Neoplatonic notion that the one is beyond all form and comprehension and so forth and so on. So the idea of the good, so-called, we call it in English maybe too casually, that idea of the good in Plato is beyond being and truth, right? He focuses on it being beyond being, which is okay, because in Plato they go together, so to speak. And all right, so what I want to get to is this, that Heidegger is critical of that notion, and so what is he going to do? Okay, if I want to put it as crudely as I can. All right, if I don't like the notion of, remember he criticizes it in the passage that we discussed last time because it's the root cause or the root of what he understands to be all later understandings of values and valuation and so forth, all kind of ethicizing, if I can put it that way, directions of metaphysics, right? And of course, quite correctly so, that is on Plato's part, quite deliberately so, because if you're looking in Plato's metaphysics for the impact of his teacher, Socrates, on him, you would say, how the hell did Socrates produce a Plato? Socrates went around saying, I don't know. And if you think you know, well, your problem is you don't know that you really don't know, right? At least I know it. I would never write the Republic if I was Socrates. You understand? I would never write a whole shelf full of philosophical dialogues that were outlining a theory of the ideas, etc. You name it, okay? Or an ideal state, so on. Socrates just could never get to that point, you see? So is Plato betraying Socrates? He didn't get the point at all? Was he really that dense, despite the fact he was so brilliant? No, because what he does is he metaphysicalizes Socrates, because when Socrates, at his trial in 399, spends what otherwise would have been a time to defend himself against the charge, right? He not only doesn't defend himself against the charge, he practically, it reminds you of George Bush, he's going to bring it on, right? And what he says, Socrates says, he spends this whole thing going on, the reason he made all these enemies, the reason he's in court today, these guys have really started to hate him and so forth, want to get rid of him, is because he pointed out to them that they didn't know what they thought they know, and people don't like that, right? And if you do that with enough people, sooner or later you're going to get your comeuppance. So of course it's understandable that I'm here. But if you ask me why am I here, that's why I'm here, and not because I don't respect the gods or any of that jazz, right? Okay. So having spent most of his defense before the jury, confirming, that he's a real wiseacre, but the substance of the confirmation is that he doesn't know anything, and at least, unlike these guys, he knows he doesn't know anything, and then he actually cross-examines them to show them up, to make them look like fools in front of the jury, So he's digging his own grave. Now, after the verdict, as I recall, it's been a while since I looked at the text, I think it's after the verdict comes in, he then says, well, he's not particularly upset about the prospect of death. Oh, I guess there's an intermediate decision. The jury. Now we've introduced this in our legal system. We finally caught up 2,500 years later with the Greeks. Now we have what's his name there? The Musawi. He was found guilty. Then they had to have another little trial to determine the sentence. Well, that's what happened to Socrates, right? So he was found guilty, and then there was the question, was he going to be fined or was he going to be put to death?
You were supposed to propose your own sentence.
Yeah. He said, well, he didn't have any money. Oh, Plato has some money, or somebody had some money.
He asked them to throw a feast in his honor to thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So after, of course, they come back with the death penalty, not because he just didn't bend. He then says, this is the point I'm getting to. He then says, well, he's not really concerned because he knows, the one thing he knows is that no harm can befall a good man in this life or in the next. Now notice, he spent his whole career saying he doesn't know, and he knows he doesn't know, but when faced with death, he knows what a good man has to worry about and what a good man doesn't have to worry about. In other words, what Plato took from Socrates, the essence of Socrates, was not simply a kind of unbridled agnosticism, you see, but whatever he didn't know scientifically was coupled with his, I can't use the word certitude because it wasn't an issue. He didn't arrive at this after doubting it, you understand? But if he were a modern, he would have been certain, you see, of one thing, namely the moral issue, right? That having to do with goodness. So that goodness issue, Plato really appreciated that. He appreciated it so much that he made it the very origin of being in truth, but being in truth is subordinate to it. That's Socrates. You see, because what were the pre-Socratics interested in? Being in truth. What were they not interested in until Socrates came along? Goodness. That wasn't their shtick. You see? Okay. Now, what's that got to do with? Just a little bit for Plato, and to say, well, yes. But Heidegger is objecting to that. Just as in today's assignment, very interestingly, he wants to distinguish what truth and untruth of being from any question of truth and falsehood. Do you see? And he said on a number of occasions, I think again somewhere in today's text, or in last time's text, he also doesn't want this to be understood in any kind of moralistic or ethical dimension, right? That's all the level of self-consciousness, all right? So in this more originary world, we're not dealing with truth and falsity. You say we're dealing with truth and untruth, but untruth there is not any kind of opposition like falsity is to truth. And what I would say is that, likewise, if there were any temptation to think that there was anything evil going on here, just say, no, that would again belong to the moral realm, right? Okay. Now, try and come back to your question. So when we discussed this last time, finish the bracket for Plato. So now, I was saying, so if I'm going to make a crude question in order to nail this down, if I'm Heidegger and I don't like beyond being, where are we going to go? I think we're going to go hither being. I think I said that last time, right? We're going to go hither being. The way in which he puts that hither being here is we're going to deviate into beyond. Okay, so if the ultimate root in some sense of the first beginning, or I would say the major root, right? Because Plato has some predecessors too. Okay, but if Plato kicks off the ball and the Platonism in one form or another continues into the modern period in some kind of modern metaphysical form, and by the way, Kierkegaard would support that because in the Philosophical Fragments he implicitly equates Hegel with a Socrates whom he explicitly confuses with Plato. All right, so Heidegger is not inventing this notion that the metaphysical tradition from the ancient into the modern period is one or another form of Platonism, and Neoplatonism, of course, plays its part in the actual history of that transition. So, if I'm not happy with this Platonic root of the origin. So I'm going to go about if I'm Heidegger and I'm into originariness, I'm into the originary. I want to say that I can't say real. You understand? That's a metaphysical term. But if I want to say the authentic origin, for want of a better term, you see, the genuine origin, the origin is not, because what was the idea of the good in Plato? It was the origin of being in truth. It was the origin of metaphysics. Are you with me? So the Platonic model is hierarchical in the sense that it's top down. In other words, I go up, I ascend in Plato from images to things to formal ideas of things, the chief level of which is mathematical forms and mathematical reasoning, and then I ascend to the highest realm of intellect, which is the direct perception of ideas that transcend the mathematics, like justice and goodness and beauty and so forth and so on, right? Well, beyond all of that, everything depends upon this ultimate origin. This is the truth of Neoplatonism. I mean, this is the Platonic element, the critical Platonic element of Neoplatonism. Everything originates, you see. In fact, Plotinus' word for the idea of what would be the idea of the good in Plato is energia, right? The energy, the it's like entelecheia in Aristotle. They're kind of interchangeable terms. But energy, the ultimate actuality, the ultimate source. So the sun is the metaphor that Plato uses in the Republic, and that's the ball of energy that radiates the light, which is both enlightening and enlivening, you see, for the earth. That's Plato's idea. So what I'm getting at is, it's no accident that, what is this guy Heidegger into? He's into the origin. He's into explicating the true origin. Do you see? And so he cannot accept Plato's notion of the origin. Okay? Plato's notion of the origin is beyond being. Well, why couldn't he do that? I mean, in other words, well, he can. I mean, there's a little problem here. In other words, Heidegger is also beyond being, but he's not beyond being. I'm saying he's hither being. He's, as it were, undermining being. All right? So how can I put this undermining, this being hither being, positively if I'm Heidegger? I put it in the notion of being, of deviating, turning off into the beyond. I want to say cutting off any direct, this is very Heideggerian, right? This deviation, which in the German, I forget, I didn't write the German down, but I looked it up. It's, maybe I did write it down. Yeah, I think it's, abgegen, abgegen, A-B-B-E. I-E. Okay, so, okay. It means turning off, right? Branching off, turning off, swerving off, I would like to say in English. I don't know, I didn't find it in my German dictionary, it might be there. Right? So Heidegger's going to, so in other words, he can't simply, remember, the temptation would be to simply turn the Platonic model on its head. In other words, put the origin, the beyond being, on the bottom. But no, that would still be beyond being in another direction, right? So it's the swerve, the turning off into beyond, you see? And that's what I'm calling okay, so to go back to the question that you asked at the beginning of the class, so as opposed to, or in contrast to, or as different than the thinking now occurring, in the thinking now occurring, what I said last time, and then I'll maybe answer the background question, is the thinking now occurring at this point. If Heidegger and the thinking now occurring arrived at Plato's definition of the good as beyond the being, Heidegger would turn off into the beyond. He would not tackle that question directly. Otherwise, he wouldn't be doing this originary thinking. Right? There's no direct challenge. The thinking now occurring has the ability, as it were, to go beyond being, right? Not swerving off or turning off into the beyond, but going beyond being. Now, what that had to do with the beyond X issue, the beyond X issue is rooted in the analysis of Levinas in Faith and Philosophy undertaken in the light of, or in the context of, the thinking now occurring. That's correct. Although I don't believe in faith and philosophy, I use that phraseology beyond X,
No,
right?
but you give a handout.
Oh, yeah, but okay, so in class, subsequently, I, in the context of the interaction of one or another of these courses, right, I made explicit the notion, in some sense discovered, which I like to do when I'm thinking, I discovered an explicit way of neatly formalizing what was going on in the critique of Levinas as a beyond X. And otherwise, so if take the text of the title of Levinas's magnum opus, Otherwise Than Being, right? Beyond Essence. Then the thinking now occurring, if I put it in Levinasian terms, is otherwise than being. It's beyond being, or beyond essence, however you want to phrase it. Thinking now occurring is. And in the context of Heidegger's swerving off into beyond, right? Not tackling the beyond being, the idea of the good, by indirection, by not taking it head on. The thinking now occurring opts for beyond being, or in this context, therefore, since beyond being is Plato's good, the origin, the Platonic origin of everything, the Platonian energeia, do you see? The thinking now occurring is beyond the good. That's what I wound up saying last time. Beyond the good. Oh, there it is. I'm looking up here. It's all the shorthand for this is down at the bottom of the handout, okay? So the thinking now occurring is beyond the good. And now I'm saying, although I don't say it on the handout, I should add this, that's another way of saying, in the most comprehensive metaphysical terms, beyond origin. That's probably, I mean, as I said last time, beyond good is shocking enough, right? But to a serious metaphysician or a serious anti-metaphysician like Heidegger, what's really shocking is to be beyond origin. And he ain't going to be beyond origin. It's clear. He wants a better understanding, a deeper understanding of origin. That's what he wants. Do you see? But to be beyond being, to be beyond X, right? He doesn't want that. He doesn't want that. Because that beyond X, in this context, explicitly means beyond origin. Okay? So if you want a real shorthand way of saying, what is the thinking now occur? When people say to me, well, give me an idea what it's about, I always say, my first inclination is to say, well, it's a thinking that's absolutely other conscious. In other words, absolutely without self-consciousness, right? And that's right. But if I were talking to a group of metaphysicians or anti-metaphysicians, I would probably better off saying, well, it's a thinking that has no concept whatsoever of origin. Just no concept of origin. Right? And that, by the way, neatly applies to that center of the circle there mathematically, or the center of the Cartesian coordinate system, which is just that called, it's the origin, right? It's the 0 point is the origin. There ain't no origin. Right? Now, of course, you're going to have to construct a whole new, what do they call that thing? Coordinate system, I agree. I understand it's a challenge. But let's be clear what the challenge is, right? The challenge is to think beyond origin. And origin, you see, what is origin? It's a beyond X idea. Are you with me, Voltron? You understand what I'm saying? Origin is not a unifocal idea. Origin, right? So it's implicitly or explicitly a beyond X kind of notion. Just as politics is on another level, right? And okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So now I think we're actually made it to today's assignment with some time to spare. That's great. Okay. Should I? Just want to make sure. Oh, the other thing, just again for the. Well, I'll wait till Adam comes back. Just. Oh, here it is. Is that him? No.
No.
Okay. Where are we now? In today's assignment, which begins on 207 and following, okay, we have again, which is something I've noted a couple of times in Heidegger, and it's related to this notion of the creative nothing, right? So in other words, the abandonment of being by being, the refusal, any number of ways in which he puts it, right? The experience of the nothing, you say, which if properly understood is not the experience of nothing in the casual sense of the word, right? It's the opportunity for steadfastness. It is the call to steadfastness. It is the call, right? That nothing which is creative and so forth. Therefore, as he points out again so he's done this before, but it comes up again as a given there on page 207 at the beginning of today's assignment in the last paragraph of 168. But how much in the light that belongs to Abgrund must the clearing for self-sheltering concealing be lit up, so that the withdrawal does not appear, that's the other term, withdrawal, refusal, all right, all of these things that are negative, all right, where in Heidegger, what we need to understand is that the negative, the not, the nothing implication of all of those ways of putting things, that negative is positive, right? It is, in some sense, creative. And so the withdrawal does not appear superficially as a mere nothing, but rather reigns as gifting, all right? So it's gifting, this is the opportunity. This is the analog in Heidegger, which I think I've mentioned before, but just to nail it down one more time. This is the analog of the notion in the thinking now occurring of receptive productivity, right? Where, unlike Heidegger, where productivity is not a bad word, right? Where creating the world is not... he says in today's assignment, I want to get to this because it requires another kind of nuanced reading. He actually says in today's assignment that what's going on here is the opposite of what he calls absolute creating. Okay? And what you want to keep in mind is that is another way of putting rather closely what he's already told us that he's going to start off, or I don't know if he says start off, but he is going in this thinking in the direction opposite to Hegel. Okay? So if Hegel is doing, in Hegel what I have is the absolute idea, the divine idea is the absolute creator of the world. But, I mean, here where absolute has the Hegelian weight, that's what I'm getting at. Okay? So an absolute self-knowing idea, that's the divine idea, and all creation is a function of that absolute self-knowing. So that's the absolute creating of the world in Hegel. That's what it is, okay? And so he has already told us on another level, in a different context, that this thinking, this conceptual thinking, is going in the direction opposite to Hegel. And he's just reiterating that in other language in today's assignment, right? That what the creating that the nothing is doing, the creating that the hollow of the jug is doing and producing its own surface, right? The jug. That creative hollowness, that creative nothing, all right? That is the opposite of absolute creating. To say, so I would say what we have here is again, in this very special sense of the word, it's the undermining. You say, the undermining of the absolute creation in Hegel. You say, is this? I guess you could say masterful. I think it would be true to Heidegger's spirit. This masterful creating. That would be the analog of the difference between absolute knowing and masterful knowing. The absolute creating and the masterful creating that's going on here. And then I think since we finally got it into today's assignment, who is doing this masterful creating? Do you say? And I think the answer has to be being is doing it. You see, using, needing, and using in the context of that need, Dasein, which Dasein, as becomes very explicit in today's assignment, will have incorporated, as it were, into itself man, humanity, mankind, all right? So the future humanness that he talks about, the future man, and here you have the echoes of the Übermensch in, one of the echoes of the Übermensch in Nietzsche, in Heidegger. The other obvious echo of Nietzsche is that, as he says in today's assignment, and we kind of touched on this, I think, last time, the voice of the people is only heard in a few, right? So it's not like we're talking about mob democracy here, right? The voice of the people, there are only going to be a few who can actually articulate the voice of a people for Heidegger, and that fewness, that narrowing down to a few who are forerunners, who are those who are to come, is very much reminiscent of Nietzsche's idea, right? But that's just by way of analogy. The other I lost the exact train of my thought there. What was the first thing I was saying about the analogy to Nietzsche before the few?
Superman.
Übermensch.
Oh, yeah. The future humanity. Okay. So that future humanity, as future, is embodied in a few. Would be another way of putting it, right? Of those who are to come and so forth. Okay. All right. Over on page 208 at the top, only now comes the collapse of animal rationale, the rational animal, back into which we are again in the process of falling headlong. Everywhere where neither the first beginning nor its end, nor the necessity of the other beginning is known. The collapse of the heretofore man is possible only from within an originary truth of being. So the collapse of the rational animal in this context is a plus, right? It's something that is made possible by the originary truth of being. And I just wanted to make a note here. It occurred to me when I was reading this passage. A couple of things. First of all, I'm reminded of Badiou's contempt for the human animal. Right? For Badiou, the human animal is just really. In fact, he actually says, I quote him in the is contemptible. I mean, he actually says that, and then. I think Badiou is sophisticated enough to forgive me for using the term. If there's any salvation of the otherwise contemptible human animal, it's by participation in the subject that comes into being, the immortal that comes into being in the wake of an event, right? Possibly. It doesn't automatically come into being in Badiou. So in Badiou you have there the kind of a carryover. In other words, he's set up for that disparaging of the human animal, because if I were to say human animal to Aristotle, he would say, you mean rational animal, don't you? And there's a kind of confusion there, you know. It's almost human animal is almost redundant, okay? But that's a whole other issue, okay? But they're on the same wavelength, right? Whether it's a human animal in Badiou or the rational animal. No, we're into something beyond that here, and something futural to that. I don't know what's beyond it. Something futural to that in the notion of this future humanness. The future humanness, I guess you could say, is the analog I want to make to Badiou's immortal subject. It's not the same thing, because Badiou, he says in Being an Event, he has a lot of, he acknowledges in key places in that text. The text is mostly about set theory, so, but every once in a while he intersperses a short chapter on somebody interesting like Pascal, or I guess he must have one on Heidegger. Heidegger appears in several different places. Anyway, I don't want to get off the track there. But so he acknowledges some positive points of contact with Heidegger, but where Badiou departs from Heidegger it's interesting. I think if we started with Hegel, we could say, I think it would be fair to say in Hegel, that in Hegel, ultimately, as all things ultimately in Hegel, you would have to say that truth and being are identical in Hegel. Because truth would read to Hegel the idea with, all caps, the divine reason, okay? And that is being for Hegel, and that divine reason which is being. Now, when I undermine that, what I get in Heidegger is being and truth belong to each other, right? Being and truth are in a relationship of belonging, like all other what otherwise would be simple polarities are not in, right? So the truth of being, right, and the being of truth. I can reverse those terms in Heidegger because there is a kind of fundamental relationship of being and truth, but you could never simply say they're identical, because watch, if you said being and truth were simply identical, I'm speaking too fast. If being and truth were simply identical and didn't more carefully belong to one another, then I could not speak, as Heidegger does speak, of the truth of being in the first beginning. Do you see? So they can't be identical, but they can belong to one another, and that gives me the leeway, right, to see the truth of being even in the form of the untruth with which being is intimately in strife in the cleavage of itself, so to speak. Right? Okay. Now, where was I going? Oh, Badiou. I just wanted, for those of you interested in Badiou, that's where he parts company with Heidegger. Badiou says, no, being and truth don't belong to each other. They're separate realms altogether in Badiou. And the realm of being is the realm of ontology, right, in which nothing new happens, you see, in Badiou, right? And then you have a kind of meta-ontological insight into the evental nature of truth. That if there is truth for Badiou, it's, number one, there isn't truth with a capital T. There certainly isn't one truth. In Badiou, there's not one anything, okay? Now, you could say that, well, yeah, I've already said it in effect, even though I didn't say it. When I point out that it's precisely when I get to the Platonic idea of the good, and now I think Plotinus, what's the Platonic idea? He doesn't speak that way. The one. Okay? Well, Badiou says, off with his head. We've got, Badiou, I've got Neoplatonism without the one. Or as he puts it, he has Platonism without the one. But of course, if you look more carefully, he probably has Neoplatonism without the one. But see, Heidegger isn't quite there. He's not ready to chop off the one altogether, but he is undermining the one when instead of simply rejecting the good beyond being, he deviates, he swerves off into beyond. You see, without directly lopping off the one. So what I'm saying is that not anticipating, I don't mean forecasting Badiou, but laying the groundwork for Badiou away from the Hegelian unity. Hegel, you have to say this for Hegel. I mean, he's certainly into oneness. There's no question about it. Heidegger is in the position, looking at it in this context, in the intermediary position of merely undermining the one, undermining the unity, you see, turning that unity into belongingness. Right? And in Badiou, the link between being and truth, that is the link between being and event, right? That's what it comes down to, is severed altogether. You'll notice there are anticipations of that, hesitant anticipations of that in Heidegger, but he can't quite bring himself unequivocally to this. He says that this originary, what he otherwise calls, I think in today's assignment elsewhere, this originary occurrence of being. There is an occurrence going on here, right? But elsewhere he's told us this cannot be, quote, represented as, quote, as an event. You see? So he's beyond event in the metaphysical sense, but he's not altogether beyond occurrence, right? So he's got he's undermining the notion of event, but he's undermining it. He's not separating it altogether, you see, from the notion of being. Not at all is he about to do that. So that's just to position him a little bit in anticipation of somebody like Badiou. The other thing I thought about when I read this particular thing at the top of 208 is that, yes, the thinking now occurring, again, another point of I don't know. I'm not. These terms are not adequate. It's not really contact. It's not really resonance. Whatever it is, relation. Whatever. There's some kind of relation, even if it's in the negative, to the thinking now occurring here. Because in the thinking now occurring, I found myself saying in the third paper of the morality seminar this past summer, I found myself in the context of outlining a table, in effect, of 9 imperatives of the new morality of the beginning. I found myself defining, in effect, humanity in the context of thinking now occurring as commodious mercy. Okay, so the thinking now occurring is certainly open to the notion that there's a perhaps a better understanding of human being than rational animal, you see. But on the other hand, what is not present in the thinking now occurring is what, if you want to call that, as it's called in the third paper, if you want to call that commodious mercy, where, by the way, you have the, if you're thinking about that, that is without calling attention to it at that point in the text, that is an explicit that's an explicit implication that the creature is in the likeness of the Creator. I mean, but in the likeness of the Creator, as I've said in different contexts in the thinking now occurring, qua Creator, not qua mind, not qua reason. Go back to, I mean, Augustine was great. He was absolutely great. But for Augustine, the Trinity was the great big, I mean, actually, there's some truth in the distortions that my friend Altizer likes to impose on the history of thought. But there is a deep truth that Augustine somehow is a forerunner of Hegel, right? Augustine is, in some sense, a forerunner of modern self-consciousness. But very particularly, you can see it in this sense, that when you look at the De Trinitate of Augustine, the precise image in the creature, in the soul of the human being, of the Creator, is memory, understanding, and will. In other words, it's the tripart structure of mind, or in a Hegelian sense, of reason, you see? So the thinking now occurring is beyond that, all right? But not not in opposition to it. All right? Okay. I just felt that I should note that. Okay. On page 210, if we look in the paragraph beginning just about the middle of the page, he says, in the other and future meaning, being does not mean occurring, but in abiding carryability, as grounding the da. The da does not mean a here and yonder. This is also relevant to what we were talking about in this other context, right? Does not mean a here and yonder that is somehow or each time determinable, but rather means the clearing of being itself, whose openness first of all opens up the space for every possible here. I love it. Understand? This is a positive explication of what he meant so cryptically when he said at the end of the last time's assignment, deviating, swerving off, turning off, branching off into beyond. Do you see? To swerve, to go into, to turn off into beyond is to go into, where am I if I branch off into beyond? If I'm into beyond, where am I? I'm in the clearing of being itself. I'm in that openness that opens up the space for every possible here and yonder. What I want to say is, for every possible, now I'm going to use my language, superimpose it on the discussion. What he's saying in effect is, this originary clearing is where I want. It's like, I'm so perverse. It reminds me a little bit of Alice in Wonderland, right? So when I fall into the hole, so if I try and put it positively, So if I'm Heidegger, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find, and this is also antithetical, as it were, if there's anything that could possibly be actually antithetical to thinking now occurring. This is, as it were, antithetical to the thinking now occurring, because what I'm doing here in Heidegger is I'm not going beyond X, I'm swerving off into the clearing, which is the space for every beyond. In other words, I'm undermining beyond X, which is another way of saying what? I'm providing for it its true origin, its true support. So don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to beyond X, I'm not opposed to the first beginning, I'm not opposed, right? How could I be opposed to the untruth of the first beginning when the untruth of the first beginning was the truth of being before now? Right? I'm not opposed to beyond X. I'm opposed to it not being properly originated or originized or something like that, right? Without it being properly understood.
So, quick
Yeah,
question
sure.
about that. It feels like, I mean, there's a lot of effort in Neoplatonic texts from Plotinus' writing and everybody on to do this. I don't know if it's precisely this.
Yeah.
I don't know if they understood that this is what they're doing, but the language, what they're writing,
Right.
is precisely this kind of saying we're not negating being.
Right.
Oneness is not the oneness as opposed to manyness.
Right.
So there's this recognition in the apophatic language that we're not negating something and then dialectically supporting its opposite.
Mhm.
So it feels to me very similar. Now, I mean, obviously,
Well,
they're
similar,
not-
right?
It's not the same.
That's right. It's not this. Well, nothing is the same, but you mean it's not identical. It's similar, and I would say, as you're speaking now, the thought that comes into my mind is, it's the same. It's the same thing that he could have, but of course could not really have, and therefore didn't. I imagine for a moment, why didn't he just turn Plato upside down? So analogously, why didn't he just turn upside down the Neoplatonic hierarchy?
Right.
Okay. And I would say that what they have in common, and this is their being constituents of the metaphysical first beginning, which is for Heidegger metaphysical from beginning to end, so to speak. So that the similarity, and therefore by definition similarity, not identical, similar. The difference in the similarity is that is the grounding of the well, if I put it in terms of his text, the grounding of time-space, ultimately the grounding of it in being, in a being which is from the get-go finite. From the get-go includes the not and the nothing. And what I'm saying, if that isn't, to be more explicit about it, in other words, that in both the Platonic and Neoplatonic and in the subsequent modern metaphysical tradition, that the being, or the one, or the good, or whatever the analog of it would be infinite being, or infinite good, or infinite one. It's that kind of difference, right? So in a sense, although not literally as I imaged it, he is turning it upside down. But he doesn't really have to bother turning it upside down because in effect it's much more penetrating. It's a much deeper move to turn off into beyond. That is genuinely turning it upside down, turning what otherwise would be an understanding of infinite being into finite being, right? It's that kind of thing.
As you're speaking, it dawns on me this another aspect to it, which is that the negation of being, or any sense of it being beyond some affirmative being, and from a Neoplatonic perspective, is usually, it's epistemological. They're saying we can't know what that is. It's beyond being because we can't know something like that.
Right.
And Heidegger isn't making a claim about our knowledge of being as if that that's what is finite. He's saying being, regardless of our knowledge of being, is finite, and that's a big difference from this kind of negative apophatic tradition or Neoplatonic.
But I just want to add something to this, which is that for Plotinus, what makes it apophatic is that it's about what we can say.
Right.
So, which doesn't affect the metaphysics in a way.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, epistemologically, yeah. But
Well,
yeah,
I wouldn't
more
even
about-
use the word epistemological there, but really, because, for Plotinus, what I can say, and I can't say it, but I can't say I can't say
Yeah,
it, etc.,
yeah.
which leaves the metaphysics as it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, thank you.
Okay, and just go back to what you said about knowledge, that would be true. But just to complicate things a little bit, notice that he substitutes in this context for knowledge in the metaphysical tradition sense, he substitutes what he calls knowing awareness, right? So there is, I would say this knowing awareness is in this context, certainly analogous to what he's doing in Being in Time when he's talking about understanding, in order to ask the question of the meaning of being, there must be some, what he calls there in Being in Time, some preconceptual understanding of being, right? Now here he's, I think, deepened and fleshed that out much more, but I think it's that kind of thing. So it's not like, so it's not knowledge in the metaphysical or traditional or epistemological sense, right? But on the other hand, it's not. There is a kind, as you yourself, I think, pointed out on day one or close to it, there is nevertheless definitely some kind of thinking going on here. I think you used the word conceptualization or something like that, right? There's some kind of conceptualization here, but we have to be very careful what we mean by thinking of concept here. But there is a thinking. Okay. Okay, so on two, well, along the same line, all right, so in this, so now I'm superimposing all these metaphors in my mind, I'm thinking Alice in Wonderland. She falls through a hole, right, to go into Wonderland. So it's been a while since I did that. But it's like the undermining idea. This is a kind of underworld. Oh yeah, see? Underworld, but again in that undermining sense. In other words, this is the worlding of world in some of his texts, right? He's not, and this is going to be important to what I want to say about the Alpha and Omega idea in a moment when we get to that page. But anticipating that, right? In other words, Heidegger is not simply, by the way, neither is Levinas. Both of them, in some sense, I'll use a word that, I'll use it loosely so I can cover them both at the same time. In some sense, they both withdraw from the world. But more carefully, they both withdraw from the world of self-consciousness, the world as it is understood in self-consciousness. Right? In Levinas's case, that he very specifically withdraws from the world, the self-conscious world, understood as some sort of juridical network, right? In other words, what he's really he's withdrawing from that, Levinas is, in order to effectively lay the groundwork for a critique of moral responsibility and so forth, what he calls a metaphysical ethics, okay? So it's really a groundwork for ethics is what he's trying to lay, Levinas is. Analogously, Heidegger, actually before him, and probably influencing the kind of thing that Levinas did in a more narrow framework, Heidegger was withdrawing from the world, but the world that he's withdrawing from is very much the world as it has been understood, say, unoriginarily in the tradition, right? In philosophy in the first beginning, right? But he's not altogether withdrawing from the world, because what is Dasein? We know from Being in Time, right? Dasein is being in the world, right? And the whole idea of thrownness and so forth, especially in Being in Time, it's implicit here and always has to be kept in mind. Being in the world, being thrown, right, is in effect finding yourself in the world ahead of yourself, right? With what in effect is the undermined form of worldly time, namely ecstatic temporality, right? Having, as it were, a future which is not a linear destination, do you say, but points to an end, which in turn is not a linear end, do you say, but points to uniqueness, resoluteness, what I called, I think last time, the one and only possibility for decision, and so forth and so on. Okay, so the world hasn't altogether, in any simple sense, gone away in Heidegger, right? And what I want to say in anticipation, what I'll be saying later, is that, which is not surprising now that I've kind of recapitulated what Dasein is. I mean, Heidegger's thinking is worldly. It's within the world, but it's not within the world as understood metaphysically. Okay, so whatever he's going to say about questioning being the beginning and the end, all right, that originary worldliness of the thinking that Heidegger is doing, right, has to be the context in which we're going to want to understand that. But let me get to that a little later. It's on this page, by the way, that he uses the term in the bottom of the page there under number 1 of creative self-outgrowing as a definition of what strength means here. And I wanted to say, for Adam's sake here, because he was the one who first raised the question, and I think it's on the handout. I keep putting. Didn't I put this on the handout about in abiding? No. Standing in? No. I just said it in class.
A being stands in being, and then a being is swallowed up.
Oh, I do. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good. I can't even read my own thing. It's on here somewhere? Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. So I think we touched on it after your first question, but I thought of it when I drew up this thing here, and it keeps coming up, of course. This in abiding is this Inständigkeit, this standing in and he associates it in today's assignment in abiding with enduring, right? It's the notion in Hegel, the finite being, as he says, and I quote him in what in effect is his critique of Descartes in Faith and Philosophy, Hegel on Descartes in effect, right? In Descartes, modest guy that he was just happy to not be nothing, to be something, right? And finite being wasn't reduced to nothing in Descartes' consciousness. He hadn't gone there, all right? Whereas Hegel, of course, looking back on it, is saying that finite being is swallowed up. That's Hegel's terminology. Swallowed up in the infinite. The finite is swallowed up in the infinite. Heidegger, in that sense, is returning on one level now, of course, because he and Husserl are in the same camp together with Kierkegaard, broadly speaking. They're all fighting the absolute appetite of the Hegelian idea, right? They're all trying not to be absolutely swallowed up, okay? And so, just as Kierkegaard's only way of agreeing with that particular point in Descartes is to resort to the absurd, right? That even though he knows better, being a good Hegelian, that his absolute nothingness of his finitude, nevertheless he believes, right? But of course now absurdly, in a way that, fortunately, I mean, boy, Augustine and Thomas, they get off light. Faith was a problem, but at least it wasn't absurd. Right? I mean, it was unbelievable. It was, anything you want, but it wasn't absolute self-contradiction, right? It couldn't be, because there was no absolute self to be contradicted by. Okay, so likewise, the in abiding, all right, has that notion of not being swallowed up, of in the Abgrund, in the withdrawal, in the fierce hail of the abandonment of being. I want to use the really pedestrian term, because I think it's where Heidegger's at, only on a very deep level, of hanging in there. I mean, not just hanging in there as a matter of will, but of standing in there, of continuing to stand, do you see? And not disappearing, not being annihilated, do you see? Because there is no, in that sense of the word, there is no nihilation. There is no nothing or not in Heidegger, which is annihilating in that Hegelian sense, which reduces to nothing, right? So that where otherwise I would be annihilated, I I inabide, and in inabiding, in some sense, I am owned, and I am, and I want to say I belong to the creativeness of the nothing or of being. Right? That's the sense of it. Okay. I was just going to say on 214, just quickly noting, somewhere on 214, he touches on what I'm discovering for myself at least, as I read through this today's assignment especially, it seems to be becoming more and more explicit in the text. All this stuff of what I'm saying about swerving into the beyond, into the clearing, which is the space for the very possibility of beyond X or here and yonder and all that stuff. You see, undermining it, that is, in a certain originary sense, giving a support for beyond X, not being beyond X. Right? Okay. Likewise, that same idea of that, what I'm calling, therefore, of being hither the good, right? Because the thinking now occurring is willing to say it's beyond the good, right? Now, of course, it wants to have the opportunity to explain itself, but it's willing to say that. But he's not beyond the good; he's hither the good, and so you get another indication of the logic of this thinking on page 214 in the second paragraph, the first beginning. But contrary to common opinion, being is the most estranging and self-sheltering concealing, and nevertheless it holds sway before all beings that stand within it. Okay, so not beyond all beings, because beyond all beings would be the good, the Platonic good, or the equivalent. It would be right. But before all beings, my language hither. I use hither because it fits in with the language I use in the Critique of Agamben in the Morality Seminar. But you could say before. All beings that stand within it. Something that, of course, can never be grasped according to the hitherto a priori. So, again, undermining the a priori, not throwing it out, but saying the from before, right, has this more originary sense, and this is what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
In Husserl, there seems to be a sense of phenomenology takes place before naturalistic thinking, or before the split into subject and object, and the need to bridge that divide. That before is maybe a moment of thinking, or for him, reflection, phenomenological reflection. Mm-hmm. Is this before? Could it relate to that kind of before, or is it before temporally, or is it before historically, like the history of thought? What kind of before is this before?
It's before originarily. It's before, as he says here. In other words, it's what I'm calling the undermining the a priori. Husserl, the truth of what you're saying is perfectly centered in Husserl, in his notion of what Husserl calls the infinite a priori of the ego. Right? Do you see? So Husserl, for all of his withdrawal, as it were. In other words, I guess what I want to say is it's not just that Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Heidegger all retreat, as it were, from Hegel, but in the retreat, Heidegger understands that he's in it. I want to say he's in the forefront of the retreat. He's the deepest retreater. Do you say? So from this depth, this originary depth, from this Abgrund, right, from this notion of time and space, Husserl appears, relatively speaking, to be an a priorist, and he would be an infinitist. Do you see what I'm saying? And so not as originary, not as fundamental. I was happy to see Heidegger today's assignment acknowledges the ambiguity of the term fundamental ontology, as well he might. Okay, saying, of course, that it's unavoidable, all right, and it may be unavoidable in the context, right, because we don't have any sharp edges here. So, in that sense, whatever the ambiguity is, his understanding of phenomenology is more fundamental than Husserl, than his masters. And so he's always very polite, very careful. I don't think there's any very clear, heavy assault on Husserl, right? But clearly he's parted company from that, or gone another step, an important, fundamentally important step deeper. I was going to say beyond, but it can't be beyond. Hither. He's more hither. You could say, I mean, the phenomenological epoche of Husserl is a kind of a hitherness, you see. But this is hither that, right? Something like that. Okay, and there a theme that we've noted before. It happens here and a couple of times in today's text, I think, too, also. But on 214 and in 181, in the second paragraph, the self-throwing, the self only becomes its own in the leap. All right, this is in other words, he says it in different ways elsewhere, but it's the notion that if it were Aristotle, one only becomes one's true self, right? It becomes one's true self in the leap. So that, again, the self of self-consciousness, or I think he says today, I, you, and we, right? All of those notions are more originally grounded in the selfhood that he's talking about. Okay, and so again, giving their true origin of those notions, and therefore undermining the notion or notions that they may be ultimate markers or indices of what Dasein is. Dasein in its own most being is more fundamental than I, you, and we, is what he's saying. Okay. Another notion on 214, just worth noting because it comes up again later on. In the bottom of page 214, in 183, he says the projecting open unto being is unique, so much so that the thrower of the projecting open essentially casts itself. And this is something by now we should be familiar with, right? In other words, the thrower cannot be separated from the throw. So the thrower, in throwing, is thrown, right? Enters into the throw, so to speak. Is not left behind, as it were, you say. And in that sense becomes, for the first time, itself, truly, you see. But casts itself into the open of the inopening that is thrown, projected open, in order for the first time, there it is, to become itself in this open as ground and abground. Shifting into openness sounds misleading in a way, as if this openness stood ready. All right. So not only are you not yourself before you leap, right? You only become yourself in the leap. It's not only that, but the corollary of that is that really, I can't say really strictly speaking here, okay? You need another word for really here. Truly, we can get away with truly. Truly, there is no throw before the throw. There is no throw that might or might not throw. And there's another thing that, as far as that goes, the thinking now occurring resonates. There ain't no pre-existence, as it were. Do you see? In the thinking now occurring, there's absolutely no pre-existence. Now, of course, there is a pre-existence of a sort in Heidegger, and that is existentia as the metaphysical translation of Dasein hitherto. Do you see? In other words, the fact that this moment is not, it's not, I want to say, it's not as momentous as this thinking is, it's not, unfortunately, it's not absolutely momentous. You see? It's, because, you see, in other words, that's why we need angst, to put it in more being in time times terms. We're eating angst because for the most part, initially for the most part, we're lost. For initially for the most part, we're in the day. And initially for the right, you see, initially for the most part, we haven't got a clue about the leap. See, the only reason it seems that that's not being emphasized in this text, and it's not, is because what we're looking at in this text, he has to forgive me. You have to forgive me, Martin. As it were, what we're getting here is a more objective view of this of the crossing that we're in, the questioning. Right? We're getting a more objective view than, relatively speaking, again with quotation marks, relatively speaking, subjective view of the matter that we're getting in Being in Time. Right? So, with all heavy quotations around objective and subjective, but you get the thrust of what I'm trying to get at. So we're not emphasizing here in this text so much, except it is emphasized in a way, but now it's done not so much in terms of our everydayness as individual eyes, of Dasein's, but it's emphasized in terms of the history of philosophy. Right? So in other words, the analog of everyday lostness of our run-of-the-mill experience and so forth, that substituted for that in this more, as it were, objective view of the Beiträge is the in effect the lostness of the metaphysical tradition. Its lack of knowing awareness. That's the analog. Okay, so in this. Okay, so. So openness occurs first of all and only along with the displacing. Okay, so there's no openness. So another way of putting this, same thing. There's no openness. Oh, there's the openness. Let's go into it. Right? There's no leap before the leap. There's no openness that is, as it were, optional. Do you see? It's only with the displacing. It's only with the shifting into, as he said. This is what started them on this. The shifting into openness. It's only the shifting into openness. It's only in the shifting into openness that there is openness. Okay. Prior to this is being away. Here's the more what I'm calling again, with apologies to Heidegger, right? The more objective view of fallenness. Prior to this is being away, and indeed constantly so. Being away as denial of having been exposed to the truth of being. Okay. And the Greek, I don't know whether he uses, does he use the Greek here? No. Somewhere else he does, I think. Somewhere he uses it, maybe someplace else in today's assignment. It's the Greek antithesis of parousia. Parousia means, literally in Greek would mean presence, or being present, something like that. Which, as I pointed out in one or another class for anybody who was absent, Heidegger treats as if there was no distinction in effect in Aristotle and Plato between ousia and parousia. In other words, he used the terms interchangeably, whereas I'm saying historically that's inaccurate. That Aristotle would not have understood ousia to be parousia. Okay, that's a separate issue, but I always think of it, so I want to say it. But the analog or the antithesis of parousia in Greek is apousia, apo, away from, right? So being absent. So it would be the Greek term in effect for absence. So this absence, notice he says, and again the thinking now occurring is perfectly consonant with this idea. This absence, this being away, is a matter of. Notice, I like it. Thinking now occurring likes it as far as this goes. He doesn't say it's a consequence of being away is not having been exposed to the truth of being. It's the denial of having been exposed to being, right? It's, I think you can put it a little more affirmatively with a little negative twist. It's an unwillingness to be exposed, right? It's kind of like, it's more comfortable. So it goes back to his notion, which he uses oftentimes about the what has to be gotten beyond here. Oh, so it's the flip side of what's good about the withdrawal. What's good about the abandonment of being? What's good about it? It brings to the fore, as it were. This is Leahy's language. Brings to the fore. I gotta think. It unearths. It brings into the clearing. It brings the clearing. It brings into the clearing and brings forth the clearing in which one encounters the what? The uniqueness and the what? The strangeness of being. The unfamiliarity of being, all right? And what do we like about the familiar? It's very comfortable, you see? So the unwillingness to depart from the familiar, all right, or to acknowledge, really, you see, behind the familiar, as it were, or beneath the familiar, or again, being time, the uncanniness, right? I mean, that's a big theme there in what I'm calling the subjective treatment of this issue, right? The experience of the uncanniness of the not being at home in the world, right? That's what angst is all about. Yeah.
There's denial of having been exposed to the truth of being. Wouldn't that be an item on your ethics index?
Oh, well, it's certainly related to it, yes. Yeah, I don't know exactly that language.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time, I don't think, but on page 218, well, actually on 217 and 218, there are a couple of uses here of the, for example, on 217, in the bottom third of the page, about a third of the page up from the bottom, Dasein's projecting open is possible only as shifting into Dasein, but the shifting, projecting open arises only from within the pliancy, the Huegsamkeit, vis-a-vis the most hidden conferment, Fügung, right? So both of those ideas have to do with the notion of fitting, joining, right? I made a note for myself in the margin here because, remember, what I referred to indirectly when I said that the thinking now occurring has an understanding of humanity as commodious mercy. And commodious, as I point out in the text of the morality seminar, literally in Latin means fitting with. That's what it means, right? It means so another, whatever that is, all right, another similarity of the thinking now occurring in Heidegger, as far as it goes, is that he's into fitting, joining. He's into some kind of, I don't know if he's into commodiousness, but he's into some sort of modiousness, right? He's undermined the whole notion of modality in every sense of the word, right? So he's certainly into joining, fitting, and so forth. But what's there in the German is the notion of, as the translation brings out, of pliancy, a fitting that involves implicitly a certain kind of submission, right? You see? Whereas the commodiousness of the thinking now occurring, where there is no belonging, right? There is no belonging, that where we have an absolute freedom of relationship existing among beings, for want of a better term. What's missing, what's not there in the thinking now occurring, in the similar notion of joining or jointure. I mean, I have no problem with the language as far as that goes, especially in English. What's missing is the notion of belonging, and therefore the notion of submission. Right? So again, the pliancy notion suggests both the finite elasticity as over against the absolute elasticity of the Hegelian idea, both the finite elasticity and also the notion of a kind of finite version of what otherwise in Hegel would be the absolute necessity, which actuality is, right? So here we have a finite form of the necessity of, in this case, the necessity of being. Okay. Now, and then on 219, that's the first time he does it, and he does it later on in today's assignment, but just to nail it down in the text, in 191, Dasein is the turning point in the turning of an owning, the self-opening midpoint of the mirroring of call and belongingness, the ownhood or owndom, understood as kingdom, the mastering midpoint of an ownment as owning the belonging together to an owning, at the same time owning the belonging together to Dasein, becoming self. I don't know how you would boil that down, but you get the sense of, well, I think we can use the word dynamic here. It's not a dialectic exactly, right? But it's this kind of counter-resonating relationship, you see. And I think I could boil it down. I don't think this would do any injustice to it, is that in this kingdom, in this own-dom that we're dealing with here, this originary undermining of the metaphysical self, right? And certainly of the I and the we and the you of everyday consciousness as the counterpoint to that metaphysical self, that here we could say what we're really dealing with is a kind of, again, I'm going to use a pedestrian term, but I think it gets something of the notion of it, and we want to deepen it, of course, but something like what we're talking about here is kind of an originary self-possession, a self-owning, all right? So, and that self-owning requires, I mean, that's not easy to do, right? And again, I think it's the originary version of the Nietzschean idea of self-mastery. What Nietzsche was really into in his deepest moments, if I can put it that way, was self-mastery. I mean, he did have contempt for half the human race, okay, or more, at least half. There was all the sickly, descending types, right? All of those who had bad instincts, right? He had no love for them whatsoever, okay. On the other hand, he understood, and therefore he would not have, in principle, a problem with a master-slave relationship. Nietzsche has no problem with that relationship in principle. What he objects to is when the slaves take over. That's the problem. It's when the slaves become the masters. As long as the masters are the masters, that's okay. But to be fair to Nietzsche, his deepest battle, as it were, as he himself says somewhere, I can't remember in which one, maybe it's The Gay Science or one of those very interesting books, he confesses, I say he confesses, he does. I can't remember the exact context in which he does it, but his real challenge, remember, he has this contempt for all the weaklings of the world, right? Strength is will to power is where it's at. But I know what he confesses. He confesses his own weakness. And so for the real challenge for Nietzsche, and this is his virtue, right? His honesty, as it were, right? I mean that in a philosophical sense. The real challenge for Nietzsche is, for him personally and for him as a type, is to overcome one's own weakness. In other words, the real challenge is not to master others, right? Even though if you look at it in that terms, it's much better that the people who master others are not weaklings, right? All right? But the real challenge for Nietzsche is self-mastery. It's overcoming one's own weakness. Now, what got me into that?
Self-possession.
So I was trying to boil down the counter-resonating in that paragraph here, that becoming self here really is, it's coming into owndom. It's coming into, in a certain sense, owning oneself, right? However, we're owning oneself. Look, even in our language, we cannot avoid. You can see, and now you can understand. You can understand Hegel. You see, I mean, Hegel is not making this out of whole cloth, right? Hegel is trying to explain our self-consciousness. So we talk to ourselves. You ever find yourself talking to yourself? I say, Dave, sorry, Dave, and I bump into something. Right? Of course, you do this more when you live alone.
You're what?
You do it more when you live alone, but it just brings out what's there all the time going on. So we talk to ourselves, and of course, when you talk to yourself, you've introduced into yourself some kind of opening, some kind of what Hegel will take to be a kind of self-division, do you see? And so the undermining of the Hegelian self-division into self and other, right, is really that in place of that may be too simple, too thoughtless in the originary sense, self-division of the metaphysical and epistemological traditions. What we're really dealing with here is ownhood and a kind of that's why I say self-possession. I'm not absolutely crazy about that term, but you get the idea. Kind of owning, self-owning, right? Becoming oneself is self-owning, and And what I'm trying to get at, where I was going was that even in that notion, as I'm putting it as of a kind of self-owning, you have therefore the belonging to self of self. You see, you have the interchangeability, as it were, of what otherwise might be taken to be, which cannot be taken in this context to be two separable poles that you see have accidentally been put into one another. So the becoming self, another way of putting all of that is that this is something of the depth of potentiality in owndom, in the selfhood and in the ownhood, which in turn, as he says later on in today's assignment, really is, in some sense, he understands to be deeper even than selfhood, right? So this owndom, this ownness, whatever it is, implies some kind of irreducible inquivering, irreducible movement, irreducible resonating, intimate strife, intimate contention, you see, within the cleavage of being. And in this sense, he's a phenomenologist. In other words, I appreciate the question, where is this going, you see, but that's not a phenomenological question. Phenomenological question is, what does it look like? How shall I describe it? What we have here is the description at the deepest level. I was going to say of our experience, but not of our experience, of the ground of our experience, right? That's a description. It's an illegitimate question to ask, well, now what? You see? That's not the question. Okay. Because if I could answer that question, then questioning wouldn't be the beginning and the end. Right? So questioning is the beginning and the end because that adequately, in a nutshell, describes the ground of our so-called actual experience. Or, if you want, of our live experience. Its deepest ground is this owndom, this ownhood. Okay.
And history,
yeah.
and the history of thought and all of these thinkers that help shape this ground.
Okay.
How does history, especially the history of thought, fit into that descriptive sense of that what's happening here is a description of the ground, the grounding of the ground?
I think the answer to your question is that if it's in the context of this description that I can understand, maybe for the first time, what history is. And history is I think he has a definition of it, which I just can't do off the top of my head, but I would say fundamentally, I forget how he phrases it, in today's assignment somewhere, I believe. But I would say history is the momentary, or history is I don't know whether it's too strong a term to use the term revelation. Maybe it's the maybe the lighting up. It's the moment in which this originary ground, the historical, is the moment in which this originary ground is, as it were, lit up or revealed or opened. But if history is that, if it's true what I said before, that in Heidegger what we don't have is an absolute momentousness. Analogously, what we don't have in Heidegger is an absolute. We don't have an absolute history. So we have history as what happens in the form of the moment, where the moment is never, where the moment is not understood in a linear context. That's the best I can do at the moment. It's something along those lines. Okay. So on 219, I think we were on 219. Also on 219, he has a nice statement here which helps throw some light on this, maybe related to your question about history too. In 192, he says, as thrown project in the third line, as thrown projecting open grounding, Dasein is the highest actuality in the domain of imagination. Granted that by this term we understand not only a faculty of the soul, this goes back to the earlier reference I was making to his reference to Kant's transcendental imagination in as something which, despite essential differences, nevertheless could be a starting place for understanding what he understands. So in that, along those same lines, he says at this point in the text, granted by this term we understand not only a faculty of the soul and not only something transcendental, but rather an owning itself, wherein all transfiguration reverberates. Imagination as occurrence of the clearing itself. And so I want to tie this in with the notion of the Da and the time-space as the site of the moment. I think it's in today's assignment to go back to your question, because all these things are all related to one another. Somewhere in today's assignment, he speaks of Earth, which he's spoken of from time to time. Earlier, he's spoken of the strife of Earth and world. And I think I pointed out to you at the time that, generally speaking, the way to understand that in terms of the metaphysical analogies is that Earth is, as it were, the materia, and world is the form and matter, or the world as the unconcealment, the opening in that sense, and then Earth as concealment. And if you think of strife, the strife of Earth and world, the strife of openness and sheltering self-concealment, as he, I think, often puts it, if you think of that as the contention of those two, there you would have a descriptive and, I want to say, constructive understanding of what history is, right? History is, in some sense, the enquivering, if I can borrow his term in a slightly different context, it's the enquivering of Earth and world. It's the moment, the site of which is time-space. All right. On page 221, we have another, I think, effective reference to that distinction, which I put on the handout in one form or another, and which we've discussed a couple of times. On page 221, the question of absolute knowing comes up again. In the bottom half of the page, after the italics paragraph, Kant's critique of pure reason, in which after the Greeks another essential step is taken, has to presuppose this context without being able to grasp it as such and to ground it fully, the turning relation of Dasein and being. And because this ground was not grounded, the critique remained without a ground and had to be led to its being overtaken, and had to lead to its being overtaken, and in part with its own means. This is a nice shorthand description of the relationship between Kant and Hegel. By absolute knowing, German idealism, which was really perfected in Hegel. Because spirit here became absolute, it had to hold covertly the destruction of beings and the complete forcing away of the uniqueness and strangeness of being, being in its finitude, and to hasten the lapse into positivism and biologism, Nietzsche, increasingly rigidifying this lapse and continuing until today. Right? And the note that I made to myself in the margin was that this thinking that Heidegger is doing is this knowing awareness as opposed to absolute knowing, right? Is an alternative to the absolute knowing which he understands the only other alternative to would be the biologism and positivism that ensued over against Hegel, not within Hegel in the same sense that Kierkegaard and Husserl and Heidegger do, but outside of Hegel altogether, outside of reason, right? A kind of, I guess you could say, a kind of unphilosophical acceptance of the, or naive acceptance of the givenness of the world. Lividly experienced? No, that's not right. Lividly experienced, you say? Whereas the thinking now occurring offers, if you can put it that way, as an alternative to the absolute self-knowledge of German idealism, absolute other knowledge, right? In other words, the absolute other knowledge that doesn't occur to Heidegger, right, for good historical reasons, if I can put it that way, is the alternative, as it were, to absolute self-knowledge, which does not lead to, right, a positivism or a biologism or whatever. So another way of putting it is, if you object to absolute self-knowledge, Hegel, then you have, as it were, you have the masterful self-knowledge, the masterful self-knowing of the finitude of being, or you have an absolute other knowledge, right, in the form of the thinking now occurring. All right. But in any event, it seems that the thinking now occurring would understand itself to solve the problem that Heidegger is attempting to solve by his swerve into what he calls beyond. All right. Well, I think it's important that we get to the end. I mean that kind of punning sense of the word. The end is on page 228, where he says, beginning at the top line, wherever Dasein is to be grasped primarily, death must be determined as the utmost possibility of the Da. If here one speaks of end, and if before all else and in all keenness Dasein is differentiated from every manner of being extant, then end here can never mean the mere ceasing and disappearing of an extant. Right? That's what I meant by, we're not talking about the termination of a linear temporal line or anything like that. If time as temporality, all right, so in other words, if the linear time of Kant and of the whole metaphysical tradition is undermined by the Heideggerian notion of ecstatic temporality, well, I've kind of jumped the sense of the line by focusing on temporality. So what I just said is true, but put a parenthesis around it. If time as temporality is understood in a non-Heideggerian way, okay, as removal unto, you see, as a kind of simple disappearance or progression down a line, right? I'm a removal unto Ontario. Right? I mean, we don't speak that way in everyday language, but you got the idea. I'm moving to Ontario. Right? So if it's moving from here to there, that's what he's saying. If that's what temporality is, moving from here to there, if it's understood linearly, okay, then end here means a no and an otherwise of this removal unto, right? So it's nice, it kind of anticipates Levinas, you see, all right? So now bring back the temporality I was referring to. Heideggerian temporality, ecstatic temporality, you see, is not a simple no to linear temporality, but it's more like in the Levinasian sense, which obviously is the Heideggerian sense, it's more like otherwise than that temporality. Do you see? Total displacing of the da as such into the away. Now here we have the paradox of the language, right? So in other words, the away, the first time we encountered the apusia, had a negative connotation, right? Here now it's going to take on a positive connotation, because in this context he's distinguishing the displacing of the da into the away, not into the pedestrian notion of absence, because now he's going to make that clear in case you think you think I'm talking about the away I was talking about before. No, I'm not talking about that. Away again does not mean the away from, right? So in German, fort da. I think it's Lacan. So Lacan has a little thing on. Freud has a little thing on the fort da, and I think Lacan examines it. That's it. Freud, the kid playing with because he's missing his mother, and what does this mean? Okay, away and here, right? Okay, so away does not mean the away from fort as mere absence, right? Because remember, he's told us earlier that when I go through into the world of Alice here, when I go into the underworld, the undermining of beyond X, I'm not going beyond X, I'm not Leahy, but I'm undermining beyond X, I'm going into that underworld, which is the very possibility of here and there. So the away, so he wants to make very clear, the away I'm talking about here is not the away opposed to here. It's not beyond X type of thing, you see, but it is a mere absence of something that was formerly extant, but it is totally other. It is the totally other of the da, totally concealed from us, but in this shelteredness, concealedness, belonging essentially to the da and needing to be sustained along with the inabiding of Dasein. As the utmost of the da, death is at the same time the core of its possibly total transformation. And therein lies at the same time the allusion to the deepest sway of the nothing. Right? Again, the nothing here having this clearly positive, creative connotation. Drop down a couple of lines. This understanding surmises nothing of the core relation between the away and the displacement of all beings in their belongingness to the da. So here away is taken on here away, which is not one of the poles of here and there. This away is consonant with the notion of withdrawal, of refusal, of abandonment, right? All of those having this gifting connotation for Heidegger. What here is almost shelteredness, concealedness advances into the da, the reciprocal relation of the da to the away that is turned toward the da. Right? So the refusal that is really a gift, right? The away that is turned toward the da. The away that you could say belongs unmostedly to the da, okay? When it's not in the mode of denying the openness, its experience, as it were, of the openness to the truth of being, when it's not in that mode, is the mirroring of the turning in the essential sway of being itself. All right? And so that's important, right? In other words, all of this stuff mirrors, in some sense, the essential, the turning in the essential sway of being itself, right? So the turning, the resonating, the inquivering, the counter-resonating, the thing I was trying to point out to before in the very nature of ownhood, right? That what otherwise becomes somehow or other explicitly, like here and there, becomes self and other at the level of consciousness, you see, but more primordially, there's a word I haven't used in a while, more primordially is really what? It's really a function of this primordial ownhood, this primordial cleavage in being. This I want to say primordial turning in being. So not the dialectical turning. So what? I mean, you could do a cartoon of Hegel, right? So the first moment starts here and it runs over here and then it runs back again, right? Okay, not from here to there. Do you see? But a turning which is not that kind of not that kind of race, right? Not that kind of, because that's what happens, right? The dialectic, in a sense, turns and turns upon itself, right? But no, this is a turning which, in that sense, never doesn't turn. And that's close. Now that I say that, it reminds me that one of the fundamental notions of the thinking now occurring, which is really off the wall, is that the circumference of the infinite circle is a straight line, said Galileo. And so Galileo said, well, it's impossible. And the thinking now occurring says, not only is it not impossible, that's the way it is, right? And therefore, the only kind of turning that the thinking now occurring would admit is the turning into an infinite straight line, a turning which in a certain sense is no turning, right? A kind of snap. A kind of snap, a kind of... So, just to tie in a thought earlier, a turning without origin, altogether, absolutely without origin. Here we have a turning, an original turning. Right? Or here we have, in that notion of a deeper phenomenology, we have here the articulation of the origin of all turning, so to speak, right? In the traditional sense of the word, physical, metaphysical, mathematical, or whatever. Okay, so come back to the end, which was what started all this. Is it, of course, convenient to figure out for oneself what is said about death according to the unexamined quotidian ideas of end and of nothing, instead of, on the other hand, learning to surmise how, with inclusion of death in the Da. Right? So death is already included in being there, or in there, right? The end is already included. Right? I don't have to go outside of myself or beyond myself in this sense of the word. Or, better, I don't have to go outside of or beyond, I want to say, the true self, the originary selfhood, of which my conscious ego is but a poor reflection. I don't have to go beyond myself originarily, primordially understood to find death. It belongs to me, and I belong to it, I want to say. The end belongs to me, and I belong to it, and the sooner I recognize it, the better off I'll be, so to speak. All right? So learning the inclusion of death in the Da, in abiding and removal unto, as the measure of the including, what is own most to end and to nothing must be transformed. The intimacy of being has fury as its own most, and the strife is always also a maze. So this is not easy, says Heidegger. It's not easy. And at any time, both can get lost in the desolateness of what is indifferent and forgotten, because that's the constant temptation, you see. Running ahead into death is not will to nothing in the trivial sense, but on the contrary, the highest Dasein, which draws the shelteredness, concealedness of the Da into the inabiding of sustaining truth. And sustaining, I don't know whether I'm going to come across it quickly in the time remaining, but on this inabiding question, he talks about stehen, standing, and ausstehen, which is withstanding. And so standing in this was a nice metaphor he used here, it seemed to me, at least the way it came across to me. What is it? Oh, the fury. Yeah, that's it. So this, this withdrawal is, he's said it elsewhere in many different ways. We got so used to it. But the fury is nice. It wakes us up. He speaks of the withdrawal as distress. And the problem is not the distress of the abandonment of being. It's the lack of the distress at the distress, right? So being distressed, that's good, okay? And distress, if you get used to the term, just recognize that this withdrawal of being is furious. I don't want to say infuriating in the sense it makes one angry, although, by the way, that's an interesting possibility, okay? But the point being what? It's like the fury of a storm, right? This absence, this being away in this sense of the word, right? The away, which is more fundamental than here and there, right? That space for all beyondness, beyond X, do you see? That which makes it possible is experienced by those who do not deny the experience, right? Is experienced as I won't say infuriating because that's English connotations. Furying. It's furying. It's something that has to be withstood. Right? To stand in it, you have to withstand. To stand in a hurricane, to stay standing in it, you are the better be able to withstand it. That's the image of the right. So in that sense, he takes very seriously. I mean, I'm so critical. I really shouldn't be. I have the same problem my friend Walt has. I mean, these guys, they are describing in different ways the experience of, what should we say, modern man, postmodern man, early 21st century man. I mean, there's a lot of truth here. They're not making this up. This is.
No, he's prescient, actually.
Yeah, right.
Still applicable.
I don't know what to say, but I mean, there certainly is truth here. There's no question about that. Okay. But what I'm saying, so part of the real truth of our experience in this world that's being described here, if you're in that world in which it's being described, then you are definitely feeling the fury of this withdrawal. This is not a matter of indifference. This is not like just a calm day. There's no one around. That's not it, right? It's more like what's his name there with the weird shows? Rod Steiger.
Twilight Zone?
Twilight Zone. One episode I always remember was with the guy walking around town. There's no one there. It's really weird, right? Everything else is there. The candy store. There's just no people, right? Okay. Well, that's a touch. That's a kind of television touch of the sense of angst. You see, that would be provoked. The sense of distress. If you take that seriously, only it's probably worse than that. If I can put it that way.